Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by the International Society of the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. Today's topic for our webinar is Child Trafficking 101, an update based on ISPCAN and UNICEF's experiences. Before we get started, I would like to review a few items and let you know how you can participate in today's webinar. Since we have such a large group today, we have everyone's microphone on mute to avoid background noises that may distract from listening to the webinar. I would like to bring your attention to the webinar control panel that is on the right side of your screen. The only sections we will be using today are the audio and the chat functions. If you have issues with your audio, please make sure your speakers are enabled by pulling down the drop-down menu and selecting speakers. If this does not work, please try sending a message to our staff person in the chat box below, and we will try our best to help you with the problem. Throughout the presentation, an ISPCAN staff member will be managing the chat function, where we welcome you to enter your questions and comments. The presenters may choose to answer questions during their presentation, or they may wait until after the end, so please be patient if they don't get to your question right away. We will also do our best to do some Q&A at the end of the presentation as time permits. Welcome everyone, and I will now turn our presentation over to our first presenter, Emily Pasnak-Lapchick, who is the End Trafficking Officer at the U.S. Fund for UNICEF, where she leads their national awareness and advocacy campaign about child trafficking, which reaches over 25,000 constituents each year.
Hello everyone, how are you doing? Can you see my screen okay? Can everyone see my screen? Okay, great. Well, I'm very excited to be speaking with all of you today, and as was mentioned, I work on the End Trafficking Project at the U.S. Fund for UNICEF, and the U.S. Fund for UNICEF works to represent children's issues in the United States on behalf of UNICEF, conducting fundraising, awareness, and advocacy here in the United States to support the work that UNICEF does in over 190 countries and territories around the world. And the End Trafficking Project was launched in January of 2012, and we have two main goals. The first is to raise awareness about the issue of trafficking, specifically the fact that it's happening in the United States, while connecting that to what's happening globally, and then to mobilize communities such as yourselves to have the resources and tools you need to take action on a local, national, and global scale. So with that, I want to start with the agenda, just to give you guys an idea of what we'll be covering today. I'm going to get into what is human trafficking. What does it look like? What are some of the forms that we see around the world? What are some of the industries where it takes place? Then I want to tell you guys a little bit about what UNICEF does to combat trafficking and to protect children, what we do here in the United States, and most importantly, different action steps that all of you can take to help stop human trafficking. So to get us started and just to get you thinking about the issue, I want to start with some true and false questions. And I'd love for you guys to just type in the chat box true or false or T or F as you see these come up. So first of all, human trafficking has been reported in all 50 U.S. states. Thank you, guys. Yes, so you're absolutely right. It has been reported in all 50 states, and we see particularly high rates in New York, California, Florida, and Texas. Secondly, trafficking victims in the United States are only foreign nationals. Good. We've got an educated group here. I see a lot of falses and no's coming in. That is absolutely correct. We do see both U.S. citizens and foreign nationals being victimized by trafficking in the United States. And the trends that we see are that most victims of sex trafficking in the U.S. are U.S. citizens, while most victims of labor trafficking have often been brought in from other countries. 1/3 of trafficking victims around the world are children. Interesting. So I see some mixed answers here. The estimates have varied, and a few years ago it was actually estimated that about half of all victims were children, but more recent estimates have put it anywhere between 25 and 28% of victims globally being children. And we see similar trends here in the United States, in most states as well, that about between 25 and 33% of victims in the U.S. are also children. And finally, trafficking victims must be kidnapped or restrained physically. Yeah, absolutely. So I see a lot of falses coming in, and you guys are right. Trafficking victims do not have to be kidnapped or restrained. Very often they're lured under false pretenses, promised a job, and then when they get there, those circumstances are very different. They might be told they owe a debt, and the exploitation begins. So to get us started, I'm just going to start by defining what human trafficking is. And this is both the U.S. definition of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, as well as a similar definition to what's under the Palermo Protocol, which was an international instrument to define human trafficking. So we think about human trafficking as a model, a three-part model. It's the act of harboring, recruiting, transporting, transferring, or receiving a person by the means of force, fraud, or coercion for the purpose of exploitation. So we call it the AMP model. We have to have at least one element of each of these, an A, an M, and a P, as part of the equation in order to be able to legally prosecute a human trafficking case. And an important distinction to note is that in the U.S. in particular, when we're talking about a child who's engaged in the commercial sex industry, the means do not have to be proven. So this is because, for example, a child who is a victim of rape in the United States is a victim of rape because they cannot consent to having sex with an adult. So they also cannot consent to their body being sold for sex. So force, fraud, or coercion do not have to be proven under U.S. federal law in order for a child to be considered a victim of sex trafficking. So when we look at the global picture, around the world it's estimated that between 20 and 30 million people are victims. About 55% of these are women and girls, and about 45% are men and boys. And this industry on a global scale makes an estimated $150 billion annually. So let that sink in for a moment, that right now in 2015, the buying and selling of human beings reaps profits of $150 billion a year. About 2/3 of these profits come from the commercial sex industry, and most of these profits are made in industrialized nations like the United States. In addition, this is what the breakdown looks like between different forms of trafficking on a global scale. A lot of people think that sex trafficking makes up the majority of trafficking cases, but in reality, almost 70%, 68% of all cases are actually labor trafficking in industries like agriculture, domestic servitude, traveling sales crews, construction sites, restaurants, hotels. A lot of low-wage jobs are very vulnerable, have vulnerabilities for the issue of labor trafficking. Sex trafficking can include pimp-controlled prostitution, it can include pornography, strip clubs, and then state-imposed trafficking very often would be, for example, a government who might pull children out of school to have them work in fields picking cotton. Or it might be rebel armed groups or government armed groups that have forcibly recruited children into the armed groups illegally. So those are some of the state-imposed forms of trafficking. In terms of the scope of human trafficking in the United States, this is a map that represents different cases of human trafficking that have been reported. And where you see the red areas, these are where there have been particularly high rates of reporting to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Now, it's important to note that human trafficking has been reported in all 50 U.S. states, so no state is left untouched or affected by this issue. Every state in the entire country has submitted a report to the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, and since 2007, they have received over 100,000 calls leading to almost 21,000 cases of confirmed human trafficking. And in 2014 alone, they received over 20,000 calls. In the first 6 months of 2015, there were over 1,345 cases of human trafficking in the United States that were reported to the hotline. And as I mentioned earlier, there are certain areas of the country where we do see particularly high rates, including California, Texas, Florida, and New York. These are the states with the 4 highest rates. This is because they have large cities. A lot of them are port cities. There's a lot of immigrant populations in these situations, and immigrants can be very vulnerable to the issue of trafficking because a lot of the visa programs that we have in the United States are also ripe for exploitation. So in terms of what it looks like, in general, we break human trafficking down into 2 main forms, labor trafficking and sex trafficking. So these are some of the common venues for both of these, and particularly common venues that we see here in the United States. Street prostitution may be one of the most visible venues in which sex trafficking in particular takes place, but there has been a large movement of trafficking online. And this is not only for people being sold for sex online, but also recruited. A lot of pimps and traffickers will turn to social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram to actually recruit children into the trafficking industry. They might also go to different malls, bus stations. A lot of runaway and homeless youth are often preyed on because of their vulnerabilities. And in terms of labor trafficking, we also see that a lot of these industries are low-paying jobs. So where there are low-paying jobs, it's easier oftentimes for traffickers to infiltrate those industries and begin to exploit people. So I'm going to talk for a moment about what fuels trafficking. And of course, there are many reasons why trafficking exists, but there are 3 specific ones that I want to cover today. The first is that it's a high-reward, low-risk industry. This means that there are very high rewards. We talked about $150 billion a year. Traffickers stand to make a lot of money, both for sex trafficking and for labor trafficking. The cost for recruiting and obtaining individuals to traffic them is often very low, and the risks are even lower. So in a lot of places around the world, we do have legislation in place to address trafficking, and the United States certainly has very strong legislation. What we see a lack of in many places throughout the globe is the enforcement of that legislation. And unfortunately, we haven't had enough training for law enforcement officials, for FBI, for social service providers to actually be able to identify trafficking victims, and therefore we see that convictions and prosecutions are very low. Human trafficking is based on the principles of supply and demand. At the end of the day, it's a business. There's a demand for cheap goods, which creates a demand for cheap labor, and there's a demand for commercial sex. And unfortunately, anytime we see a high demand for any product, including human beings, there's always going to be someone willing to meet that demand with a supply, even at the expense of another human being. And finally, systematic inequalities. These can be considered push and pull factors, factors such as extreme poverty, lack of education, lack of access to health care, poor child protection systems, systems of discrimination, conflict, and displacement make people vulnerable and more susceptible to being exploited and trafficked. So these are many of the main reasons why trafficking exists. And now I want to dive a little bit deeper into what both labor trafficking and sex trafficking look like in the United States. So we just discussed some of the different venues where labor trafficking and sex trafficking occur. And in the United States, victims can be trafficked into the U.S. and within the U.S. to work as laborers in the agricultural sector, such as the tomato fields in Florida. We've seen women and girls being trafficked in the U.S. as cleaning staff in hotels or as domestic servants in American homes, working long hours with little to no pay. Children can be trafficked into traveling sales crews, which we've seen spike, especially in recent years, or forced to work in dangerous industries like manufacturing and construction. And while these numbers can be difficult to understand, and I think statistics are powerful to show us the scope of what trafficking looks like on a global scale, at the end of the day, this is a human issue. It's something that's happening to human beings. So I want to share a story with you of a young girl who is victimized by labor trafficking in the United States. So I want you to meet Natalia. Natalia was born and raised in a small village in Ghana. Throughout her childhood, her and her family lived in extreme poverty. And like many people in their community, her parents struggled, especially to pay school fees for all of their children. So when Natalia's parents' friends offered them the opportunity for Natalia to receive an education and learn English in the United States, her parents were thrilled. They accepted the offer and sent her to the United States with the family friend on the conditions that she would go to school, learn English, and help with chores around the house. She was 13 years old. Shortly after Natalia arrived in the United States, she was abused physically and sexually by her father's friend, the man who owned the house that she was now staying in. Over the next 6 years, she was forced to clean the house, wash their clothes, cook, and care for 3 children, often working 18 hours a day while receiving no form of payment. She was never allowed to enroll in school as the family had promised, and she couldn't even go outside or use the phone. She had no way of contacting her family to let them know what was happening. She lived in constant fear of violence and abuse and had no way of getting help. The family friend had taken away her travel and identification documents, so she would have no means of getting help even if she were to escape. And even if she were to escape, she would have no way of proving how she was in the United States or that she was allowed to be there. One day, after experiencing a severe beating, Natalia saw an opportunity to escape. She ran out of the house, and luckily for her, a neighbor spotted her and noticed that something was probably wrong. She helped Natalia to get to a local hospital where the nurse was able to identify her as a trafficking victim and call the National Human Trafficking Hotline to report what had happened to Natalia. Within hours, Polaris, who runs the hotline and runs local services in Washington, D.C., was there to assist Natalia with psychosocial support. She was eventually brought to their service shelter where she received ongoing psychosocial support and also began to enroll in school and get the education that she always wanted. 6 months later, she's actively engaged in school and is pursuing her nursing degree, wanting to move forward and to help people. Natalia is just one example of labor trafficking in the United States. Now, to go through this story, I want to ask a few questions, and again, you guys can respond to these in the chat box. First of all, what were some of the factors that made Natalia vulnerable to trafficking? I see poverty, economic status, isolation, her age, absolutely she's a child, lack of education, hope, living in the country, her gender, absolutely. You guys are hitting on all of them. She doesn't speak the language. Yeah, and I think what's at a lot of the root of what you guys are sharing is that there were lack of opportunities in the community that she came from. And her family saw an opportunity to give her an education and opportunities that she might not have had she stayed in her small village in Ghana. So how did the family friend take advantage of her situation? What were some of the tactics of control that he used? Fear, coercion, empty promises, yep. Yeah, promises of a better life, taking away her identification, language barriers, great. Punishment, sexual abuse, physical abuse, no pay, isolation, fear, absolutely. And someone also mentioned in the previous question her age. Trust in the family friend, absolutely. Threats to her family. This is great. So when you think of a child, someone who's 13 years old being in a foreign country with someone who she thought her family trusted, and she might not know that what's being done to her is wrong. She might feel guilty that she feels tied to this individual since he's a close family friend. So I think you guys hit on a lot of the ways that he took advantage of this and some of the control tactics that he used. And what made it difficult for Natalia to leave her situation? You guys have already hit on this a little bit with lack of travel documents, isolation. Is there anything else you can think of? No one to go to, absolutely. No documents, illegal status, Fear, no money. Language barriers, huge. No knowledge of the legal system, exactly. She doesn't know whether or not she's allowed to be there. Yeah, so this is fantastic. You guys are hitting this right on the head, the fear of the police. And what's interesting about this is very linked to a lot of the control tactics that traffickers use, and a lot of the reasons why particularly people who are brought to the United States aren't aware of whether or not what's being done to them is illegal. They aren't aware of whether or not it's wrong. And a lot of times the traffickers will tell them that if they go to the police, they'll be deported or they'll be beaten or that something will happen to their family. And as a child in particular, and as someone who is not from the United States, doesn't know the laws here, doesn't speak the language, you can understand the fear that she might feel leaving her situation. And then finally, what actions helped Natalia to ultimately leave her situation? The neighbor, absolutely, Vicki. Herself, I like that. She had experienced a severe beating and decided to leave. The nurse, yeah. The nurse being educated about trafficking, great. Yeah, so you guys have gotten it. And I think two things that are important to note here is one, the neighbor noticing that something was wrong. I think a lot of times we have situations, both in the United States and in other countries, where we think, oh, we'll just mind our own business. But if that neighbor had minded their own business, Natalia wouldn't have been able to get out of this situation. So as community members, we have a responsibility to one another, to our friends, to our neighbors, in order to report things that we think might be happening in our communities. And in particular, the nurse being trained on trafficking, this is huge. And this is part of the work that UNICEF does on a global scale to train healthcare providers, social service providers, teachers, law enforcement, border patrol officials, so that they're able to recognize trafficking victims. And we know that the more training occurs with these types of groups, the increase we see in identification for victims, and therefore them being able to be removed from these situations and ultimately get the services that they need. So thank you all for being so engaging. I love it when you guys give all these answers. It's great. So sex trafficking in the United States. I mentioned some of the forms that we see before, and as I mentioned earlier, most victims of sex trafficking in the U.S. are actually U.S. citizens, and a lot of groups that are vulnerable tend to be runaway and homeless youth, youth who may have been kicked out of the home for identifying as LGBTQ, and once they're out on the streets, they're often approached by traffickers and lured into the commercial sex industry. And to illustrate this, I'm just going to go through an example of what a typical victim in the United States looks like. And while I'll be using a girl in the example, I do want to emphasize that boys are also trafficked for sex, and as well as adult males. So please keep that in mind, even though this particular example will use a girl. So the average victim in the United States is anywhere, they start in the commercial sex industry anywhere between 12 and 14 years old is what most social service providers see. So this young girl is forced to serve 5 buyers a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. What that means is that she's forced to serve 35 buyers a week, which means over 1,800 people a year. So that young child is being raped over 1,800 times per year. And to look at the other side of it, the trafficker's salary, using the same exact equation. In the US, the average is about $200. So using 5 men, $200 each, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, that trafficker is making $364,000 per year by selling a young child for sex. So we can see here just how profitable it is even for just one individual. And the thing to note here is that most traffickers are in control of more than one victim. So if you think about this average scenario, if a trafficker is controlling 3 victims, they're making over $1 million a year selling children and women and men and boys for sex to these buyers. So we've illustrated some examples, but I want to pose the question, who can become a victim of human trafficking? So I'm seeing vulnerable children, I'm seeing men, women, I'm seeing a lot of anyone's, vulnerable young people, and I love this one, trafficking doesn't discriminate. That's exactly right. Anyone can be trafficked regardless of class, education, gender, or age when forcefully coerced or lured under false promises. And what's behind a lot of trafficking is actually individuals looking for legitimate work. And at some point, most of us will look for a job in our lives. So we could all potentially be vulnerable to trafficking under the wrong circumstances. So now I'm going to get into what UNICEF is doing to combat human trafficking. And when a lot of people think about UNICEF's work, a lot of times people think about UNICEF's life-saving work to provide immunizations, health care, water, sanitation, and hygiene. But UNICEF actually focuses on a lot of different areas. And UNICEF is an international children's organization, for anyone who doesn't know, and has saved more children's lives than any other humanitarian organization in the world. UNICEF was founded after World War II, but the mandate was extended several years later in order to be a long-term sustainable program to help children all around the world. UNICEF has a presence in over 150 developing countries and also has a presence in 35 additional countries doing fundraising, education, and awareness work. So we work in these 7 issue areas, but for the sake of today's conversation around trafficking, I want to focus on UNICEF's work in child protection. When we talk about UNICEF's work in child protection, there are 2 main pillars to UNICEF's work. One is around strengthening systems, and one is around addressing harmful social norms. So in strengthening systems in every country that UNICEF's working on the ground, UNICEF has a relationship with the government. UNICEF's been invited by the government to work in their country and help the government develop sustainable systems to protect children. So what this can look like is using the existing systems and strengthening them to make sure that vulnerable children aren't falling through the cracks. This includes, as I mentioned earlier, providing training for Border Patrol officials and law enforcement to be able to identify child victims of trafficking and other abuses, and also to treat them in a child-friendly way. In a lot of places around the world, and even in the United States, sometimes we see children who are victims of a crime actually being treated as criminals. So UNICEF makes sure that children are treated as victims, that they're treated in a child-friendly way. And in a broken child protection system, we might see, for example, children being placed in jail or prison with an adult. And you can think about some of the negative implications that this could have. And that's kind of a top-down approach. And then on the other side of it, we work on addressing harmful social norms to children. And what I want to note here is that there are a lot of social norms that are really beautiful, and we want to preserve those. What I'm talking about here is things that are harmful not only to that child, but to the entire society. So this includes things like child labor, child marriage, female genital mutilation, possibly children in armed conflict in certain parts of the world. And the thing that's great about UNICEF is at least 80% of all staff who work in the countries are actually from that country and community. So they grew up within those social norms. They understand the systems that are in place, and they're able to work within those in order to help protect children and promote children's rights. And an example that I like to use here is around child marriage. When UNICEF was first working to address child marriage, a lot of the work was focused on trying to empower children, but ultimately the decision's not up to the child whether or not they're married off at a young age. So then UNICEF started to work with the mothers, because very often the mothers had been married as children. But ultimately, it's actually the father's decision in many places that is the head of the household. And even if we had worked to convince an entire family, and that family had decided that we're no longer going to marry off our child, we want them to continue their education, to be able to earn income, and to be able to have their childhood, oftentimes, because it's a social norm, that family would be ostracized from the rest of the community. So ultimately, what UNICEF discovered and what has worked really well and really efficiently is working with the leaders of communities, people who are really respected, trusted, and admired in communities. That might be a faith-based leader, it might be a chief of a village, it might just be someone that everyone looks up to. And by working with those leaders, we're able to create influence and change within communities. And by working with those leaders to help them understand why it's not only harmful to that child, but to the entire community when a child is married off at a young age, we see great change happening. And what's beautiful about this approach is in many places where we've seen communities come together and say, we're no longer going to practice child marriage, they've actually gone out into surrounding communities and educated those communities on how they went through that process and how it's benefited their community. And I think this is one of the things that I love so much about UNICEF's work and UNICEF's mission, is that ultimately we want to put ourselves out of a job. And we see this ripple effect happening where we empower the groups on the ground to take control over their own lives and to take control over protection issues and development issues. And this is ultimately the goal of everything we do. So to give you a few more examples of how UNICEF helps, I mentioned helping governments strengthen child protection systems. So for example, making sure that there are proper child labor laws in place, but also making sure that those laws are actually being enforced. Supporting the training of these various groups to spot signs of trafficking and treat children with dignity. To ensure that child victims are placed in safe environments and provided with social services, health care, and psychosocial support after experiencing trauma or abuse. And finally, as I just mentioned, working with communities on the ground to change harmful social norms that may increase children's vulnerabilities to trafficking. So here in the United States, I mentioned a little bit earlier that one of the things that we do is to raise awareness about trafficking and then also to help inspire action. So some of the ways that we do this are through webinars like we're doing today. I was speaking at an interfaith convening this morning with different faith-based leaders in New York City coming together and figuring out how we can work together as a community to raise awareness about this issue. We also work with a lot of high school and campus clubs throughout the country. We have around 600 total clubs full of very inspired youth who work to advocate on behalf of the world's children at their schools and in their communities. We have a program called Shut Out Trafficking where we work with student athletes on college campuses and universities to create a week's worth of outreach programs on each of those college campuses. And last year we were able to reach almost 20,000 students on 10 college campuses, and this year at just the first 3 schools we've already reached over 33 students with messaging around trafficking and what they can do to take action. We've also done a lot of work around advocacy. So I mentioned that UNICEF does a lot of work to strengthen child protection systems in other countries, and we're also working here in the United States to ensure that there's proper legislation on both a federal and state level to protect children. And on a state level, we focus mainly on safe harbor legislation, which ensures that children under the age of 18 who are in the commercial sex industry are automatically treated as victims of a crime, as victims of sex trafficking, and are given services rather than being prosecuted for a crime. And unfortunately, in most states in the U.S., those laws don't exist. So we're working very actively with different communities to help ensure that those pass. And on a federal level, I'll get into a piece of legislation that you all can support in a few slides. And finally, we've also done public awareness campaigns. So we've put out public service announcements on radio and television. We've had billboards and posters in places like malls and bus stations where we know traffickers go to prey on kids. And in all of those resources, we have the National Human Trafficking Hotline. So if someone is being victimized themselves, or if a community member thinks they identify a case of trafficking, they know where to go to be able to report the crime. So my favorite part, how you all can take action. In addition to what I'm about to share with you, we have a number of resources that I would be happy to send to you. A fact sheet, a toolkit with over 20 ways to take action, resources for middle school and high school students and educators to bring this issue into the classroom. So my contact information is at the end for any questions you may have. So first is just using your voice. One of the things that is difficult for us to get the work done is that not a lot of people know what trafficking is. They might have heard about it in the news, but they might think that it's just sex trafficking, that it might only happen to women and girls. They might not know that it's actually happening in the United States. So by using your voice to tell just 5 people one thing that you learned in this presentation today, you can make a huge impact. This can also be, you can also use your voice to challenge social norms that we have in our own countries. In the United States, I see that the glorification of pimping is a huge social norm. And I'm not just talking about rap lyrics. I see things for how to pimp your popcorn if you would like to cook, or if you're a yoga enthusiast, there's a website to pimp your map. Or if you're a frequent traveler, there's a website to pimp your stay. So why is it that we glorify pimps and talk about them as cool guys, and some young kids might even aspire to be a pimp, when in reality these are the human beings that are providing a steady supply of human beings for sale to other human beings. These are the people who prey on vulnerable kids from broken homes and have referred to schools as buffets for new recruits. So by challenging some of these social norms, if you hear your friends or your family saying them, that's also a simple way that you can take action every day. So I mentioned the legislation that we're a part of, and as you've heard several times throughout this presentation, runaway and homeless youth are extremely vulnerable, both in the United States and globally, to trafficking. And what we've actually seen in the U.S. in recent years is that over 50% of all children that we're identifying as having been trafficked are either runaways, are homeless. Very often they've been part of the foster care and child welfare system. So this piece of legislation, the Runaway and Homeless Youth and Trafficking Prevention Act, would put in place different protection and prevention systems to help protect children from trafficking. If a child is identified as having been trafficked, there are specific services that would be instituted for them. It would also create more shelters and safe homes for kids so that they don't have to be out on the streets and be vulnerable to trafficking in the first place. And we've already had over tens of thousands of people write letters to their representatives asking them to pass this legislation. And on the bottom of the screen, you'll see a direct link to the website to be able to write to your representatives and ask them to pass this. So this is a great piece of legislation. We would love for your support, and it's an easy way to take action that will take only 30 seconds of your time. Learning the signs. So earlier in Natalia's story, we saw how the neighbor being able to respond really saved Natalia's life. It got her out of that situation. And when I showed you the map of the National Human Trafficking, or of the U.S. and all the reports that the hotline had received, most of those reports don't come from people who work for NGOs, don't come from victims, they come from community members, like everyone who's tuning in today. So if you live in the United States, this is the National Human Trafficking Hotline. We encourage everyone to put it in your phone and to learn the signs to be able to identify a child trafficking victim. This is a postcard that you can download off of our website. So if you want to post this hotline around your community, maybe in bars, restaurants, truck stops, places where we know trafficking victims might be, we would encourage you to do that. And we've seen that the more often this is posted in communities, the higher call volume the hotline actually receives. So it's not that trafficking isn't happening in our communities, it's mostly that people don't know where to turn and what resources to use to access this. So feel free to download this, and also please put this number in your cell phone. Join or start a UNICEF club. So as I mentioned, we have over 600 high school and campus clubs all throughout the country. And if you are in school yourself or possibly have children or nieces or nephews who are in school, this is a really great way to be involved in all of the work that UNICEF does, not just on child protection and child trafficking, but on all of the wonderful work that UNICEF does to protect children on a global level. So if you're interested in starting a UNICEF club, I'd be happy to talk to you about that as well. There's a great website called slaveryfootprint.org, and unfortunately, through the products that we're buying, the clothes that we wear, the food that we eat, we're inevitably contributing to the demand for trafficking, and we're inevitably connected to the lives of exploited people all throughout the world. And slaveryfootprint.org is a survey that takes about 15 minutes to fill out where you input different aspects of your lifestyle. The food that you eat, the clothes that you wear, the sporting equipment that you have, and it calculates about how many slaves you have working for you. Now, this is not a fun number to find out for anyone, but the good news is there are also actions that you can take on the website to help offset your footprint. One of those is by writing to companies to ask them what they're doing to investigate slavery in their supply chains and to encourage them to do this and to make sure that they're partnering with companies that are made in a free world, is what slaveryfootprint.org likes to say. Another way to ensure that the products that you're buying aren't connected to child labor or slave labor is by choosing fair trade products. Fair trade is a certification system that ensures that no child or slave labor was used in the production of products. And most commonly, this can be found in tea, coffee, sugar, chocolate, which is personally my favorite, but you're starting to be able to identify more and more brands that offer fair trade products. Starbucks has a fair trade line, as well as Dunkin' Donuts. Ben & Jerry's, which is my favorite ice cream, has committed to going all fair trade, and they've started doing this because they've heard consumer demand. So the more we're telling the companies that we love to buy from, the products that we love, that we want to ensure that the products we're buying are not connected to slave and child labor, we'll see a shift start to happen among companies really taking a look at their supply chains and choosing to buy from suppliers that they know are not exploiting people. Hosting a film screening. So if you're interested in educating your community more, this is a fantastic film. It's a documentary called Not My Life, and it was filmed on 5 continents over a period of 4 years. It's extremely comprehensive and has, you'll hear from survivors, you hear from advocates in the field, you also hear from people who are working in law enforcement agencies to try and address this issue. And it takes you around the world and has 3 cases in the United States as well of both labor and sex trafficking. And it's been a really great tool for us to use in order to help people understand exactly what this issue looks like. So we offer DVDs of this film, both a 60-minute version as well as a 30-minute version, which is more appropriate for younger audiences. And you can host a film screening in your community, whether that's at your congregation, possibly in your school, in a community group that you're a part of, or even just in your home with a small group of friends and family. And we have a film discussion guide to help you lead a discussion around the issue of trafficking. So if you're interested in this, my contact information is at the end of the presentation, and feel free to contact me to obtain a copy. So at this point, I'll pause for any questions. I know some of them might have been coming in through the chat function, and I'll go ahead and put my contact information up here as well. But happy to take any questions that you guys have about anything that I've covered. I see some comments from Rotary members, and yes, we love Rotary and love the partnership that we have with you guys. So this is great. Thank you. Someone was talking about the Modern Slavery Act, which was passed in the UK earlier this year. This was a really comprehensive piece of legislation, and actually UNICEF UK, which is the national committee there, did a lot of work on advocacy, and they're also on the advising council to make sure that the laws actually enforced now that it's been passed. So they've done a lot of great work, and it's kind of been a piece of model legislation. They looked at the Trafficking Victims Protection Act here in the United States, but really made a lot of great progress with that act that was paid, and that was due to years and years of advocacy on behalf of many people in the UK as well as UNICEF UK. Defining a child. So UNICEF defines a child as anyone under the age of 18. So Andrew is asking if someone has tracked the enforcement of laws. So there are some mechanisms that are tracking what governments are doing, and one of those, each year the U.S. State Department produces the Trafficking in Persons Report, the TIP report, which ranks different countries. There's some debate as to whether the rankings are always true or sometimes used as a political tool. However, it ranks countries on what the government specifically is doing to address trafficking. And it's tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And if a country is on tier 3, the U.S. reserves the right to put sanctions on those countries if they're not doing enough to address. I encourage you to check that out. In terms of the United States, there are several organizations that track laws that are in place as well as the enforcement. Polaris, who runs the National Human Trafficking Resource Center, has a map of the United States of I think the first iteration of it was they had between 5 and 10 laws that they thought should be standard and in place in every single state. So that's one piece of it. And now the second iteration, as a lot of the states have adopted most of those laws, is now looking at the enforcement. So you can, if you search Polaris or National Human Trafficking Resource Center or National Human Trafficking Hotline in the U.S., you should be able to find that information. And I believe Safe Horizons also has some information on that, although they're more specifically focused on child sex trafficking. So there's a question on advising on law enforcement developments for detecting child trafficking. So again, I would turn you to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. The hotline not only is a place to report trafficking, but if you are a law enforcement official and if you're a healthcare professional or anyone who might be interested in a training on trafficking to be able to identify trafficking victims specifically for the industry that you work in, you can call the hotline and request that, and they have connections with different groups throughout the country that can provide those trainings. They also have several trainings on their website as well, in case you want to take a look at those. So that would be my suggestion for law enforcement in terms of detecting child trafficking. But if that didn't answer your question, feel free to be a little bit more specific, and I can answer it in a better way. Okay, so good question. Do you think the refusal of the USA to ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the CRC, is a demotivation to other countries? Well, UNICEF's mandate is actually based on the CRC, so it's at the core of everything we do, and especially at the U.S. Fund, we would love for the United States government to actually ratify the CRC. For any of you who don't know, the U.S. is the only country that has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which ensures just basic protections for children to have the right to go to school, the right to an education, and this is something that we're definitely advocating for. So if you live in the United States and you're passionate about child rights, definitely would encourage you to reach out to your representatives and encourage them to look at ratifying the CRC for the United States, because I think that in a lot of ways other countries do look to the U.S. That's kind of why the TIP report has been effective in helping in motivating other countries to take action against trafficking. So I also think if the U.S. actually ratified the CRC, we would see something similar happen with child rights around the world. So thank you so much for asking that question, and it's definitely a personal passion for mine as well. Yes, so there's a great question about when safe harbor laws have been passed. Unfortunately, there still aren't a lot of places for children to go once they've been removed from a situation of trafficking. So this is definitely a problem that we're facing all throughout the country, is a lack of housing. And, you know, it's quite devastating and disappointing that we see the FBI and law enforcement doing these huge trafficking stings, and then children, you know, they pull so many children out of these situations, but then they don't have anywhere to take them. So the children actually end up in detention centers, which can oftentimes re-traumatize them, and that's not something that we would ever want for a child. So there are a lot of great local social service providers throughout the country. I think one of the major challenges that we're facing is that a lot of those social service providers and safe homes are shutting down because there's a lack of funding. So we already have a lack of housing, and just in the past few years we've seen a lot of really incredible survivor-led service providers have to close their doors because there's not enough funding. So I would definitely encourage you guys, if you live in the U.S. or even in other countries, to fund local social service providers who serve victims of trafficking, because if those doors close, we're just going to have, you know, we can't continue to pull people out of situations of trafficking with nowhere to put them, particularly children. So I would definitely encourage you to look at organizations like Christie's House. Courtney's House is also great. And another issue that we face is that while there are several safe homes for women and girls and victims of sex trafficking, there's virtually no housing in the United States for boys and men. So that's another really huge gap in the field, particularly in the United States. And there are groups, CAST LA does some work with male victims, and there are actually some groups in the Florida area that are starting to create those groups as well. The Florida Dream Center in Tampa, Florida is about to open one of the first safe houses in the country for boys, which is huge. So again, trying to help with in any way that you can financially to support those types of service providers would be a great help to the field. So the last question that came in about repeating those referred to U.S. agencies. Can you be a little more specific about what was it that you wanted me to repeat? Okay, well, I think I'm also getting close to the end of my time. I don't know, Angela or Amy, if you want to take it over and switch it over to the next presenter. But if anyone has any additional questions for me, please do take down my email address. I'm more than happy to respond, send you additional resources. If you're interested in the film, I can send that to you. And for those of you who are interested in the slides, please feel free to email me, and I'm interested in knowing what you'd like to use them for, and then we can think about what I'm able to send to you. So please take down my email address, and please be in contact with any more questions. Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Emily. That was really great, very informative. Next for today's webinar, we have Dr. Jordan Greenbaum, who works for the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children on their Global Health Initiative. She's also the former medical director of the Stephanie V. Blank Center for Safe and Healthy Children at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, where she continues to work part-time. Today, Dr. Greenbaum will provide some basic information on the ISPCAN Child Trafficking Initiative, as well as details about a child trafficking presentation that she will be giving at the 2016 Global Institute this January.
Thanks so very much. This is Jordan Greenbaum, and I just want to take a few minutes at the end of this really excellent presentation by Emily to give some information on the International Society on the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect's initiative on human trafficking. We are in collaboration with the American Orthopsychiatric Association on a big initiative, and we wanted to share it with you and hopefully get your input. Not sure why it's not moving forward. I don't have control over the slide. So before we really get into it, I just want to give some examples about child trafficking. Our initiative is really focusing on children around the world as victims of trafficking. We, of course, realize that there are adults as well, but our focus is going to be on child trafficking. And these include cases like this. An 18-year-old refugee from Syria is approached by a man at the Vienna train station and told that he can give her work as a secretary in his business. So she goes with him, and he takes her to his brothel, which isn't the business he had told her about. You can imagine what happens after that. Or another example, a poor family in rural India sends their son with an uncle to Mumbai to work at a hotel. But the uncle takes the child to a massage parlor and leaves him with the owner, where the child has to stay and work and perform sex with the clients. Or finally, a family from Guatemala sells all of their belongings to pay a coyote to smuggle them into the United States. But when they arrive, they're told that their debt is doubled, and they must work on a farm in California until it's paid. Both parents and the 6- and 8-year-old children work 14-hour days in the fields with no pay, living in a hut with 4 other families. I think we need to consider how human trafficking affects children. We tend to think, well, children are victims, and that's a very important part of child trafficking. And they may be victims of labor or sexual exploitation, as Emily pointed out. But we also have to think of other things. We need to recognize the impact of human trafficking on children, even when the trafficking doesn't involve them specifically, it involves other family members. So think about recognizing the effect on kids when a parent disappears and does not come home. They go overseas to get a job, and they're only supposed to be gone for 6 months. They don't come back. What happens to the children who are left behind? Or when a parent is able to come home, after being trafficked for 2, 3, 4 years, finally able to escape and comes home, but only to find that the parent is ostracized from the community because they accuse the woman of being a prostitute. And so the family is ostracized as well. Or if the parent comes home but is so battered and damaged when they come home that they cannot really act as parents. So there are a lot of ways that we really have to think about, well, how does human trafficking affect kids? It's more than just direct victimization. Human trafficking, as we know, is an enormous global problem, but there's tremendous variation in how the problem is understood and addressed depending on the country, depending on the area within the country. Certainly within the United States, there's tremendous variation, but even more so around the globe. So we have to acknowledge there are differences in the way that governments respond to human trafficking, and the way law enforcement is trained, in the focus law enforcement may have on human trafficking. In some countries, it may be very much focused on labor trafficking. In other countries, there may be more of a focus on women and sex trafficking. If you look at the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime study that was published in 2012, they looked at trafficking in something like 128 countries. And they compared the trafficking in these various countries, and they found some major regional differences in the makeup of the victims and the type of trafficking. And I think a lot of this represents true differences around the world. But some of it represents just differences in the way the countries focus on their particular problems in their area of the world. And so there may be differences in the attention that is paid on certain types of trafficking. But we know that there's a lot of regional differences and some commonalities. One thing that we know is prevalent all around the world is that there are very, very limited resources. And everyone is looking to find more resources for direct victim services, resources for training, resources for prevention. Unfortunately, a lot of what the efforts that have been going on around the world suffer from is this lack of coordination. There's a lot of duplication of effort. There's not a lot of research that can inform our practice. If you look at the actual studies that have been done on human trafficking victims, they're often very small studies, and necessarily so. It's very hard to study this population, so we don't have a lot of evidence base for our research. And as a result, our prevention efforts and intervention efforts are largely untested. Well, we know that as a response to human trafficking around the world and people realizing their limited resources and the silo effect, people are beginning to form coalitions. And certainly this is an emerging response at the local level, and we see this within communities in the United States and all over the world. People are getting together, multidisciplinary teams are getting together to pool their resources, and this is tremendous. They may or may not focus on child victims. Sometimes they focus on adults and to the exclusion of children. They often tend to be more reactive than preventive. So people are getting together to figure out how to respond and how to intervene with less focus on prevention, which is too bad. There are also national efforts that have emerged, coalitions forming. So some of these coalitions are sector specific, for example, corporate coalitions or religious coalitions, while others are distinctly multidisciplinary. But the problem, even with the coalitions, is there's still too much isolation, very little cross-fertilization, duplicated efforts, and when you have very limited resources, this can be a real problem because we tend to reinvent the wheel over and over and over and fail to take it any further. Instead of combining efforts and taking it to the next level, we just keep reinventing the basic levels. And as I mentioned before, there's a lack of quality of information because we don't have a lot of research, we don't have a lot of evaluation of programs, we don't really know what works. And so it's very difficult for organizations to decide how to respond to things if they don't have a lot of evidence base to know what works and what doesn't. So in response to this, ISPCAN is working with the American Orthopsychiatric Association to create this network, the International Network to Prevent Child Trafficking. And we like this coalition because it's basically from the start, because it involves ISPCAN and AOA, it's interdisciplinary. We know that the members of these two organizations span a lot of different professions, for example, law enforcement, mental health professionals, medical professionals, child advocates, legal, et cetera, et cetera. So they're coming with a lot of perspectives and a lot of expertise. And they're also global, and it's tremendous the amount of wisdom that is spread around with all the members of these both of these organizations. So we can find out what's happening in India, we can find out what's happening in Ghana, what's happening in Canada and the United States simply by asking our membership, and that really puts us 3 steps ahead of a lot of coalitions because we have this built-in diversity. We want to focus on global child trafficking and not get bogged down with any particular country, but really look at the global issues and focus on prevention and education as well as other things, but really sort of target prevention and education. Our coalition, the network, will be child-centered because we're focusing on child trafficking, but really family-focused. As I mentioned before, the impact of human trafficking on children can be manifested in a number of ways. The child's not always the victim or may not be the only victim. So we really need to consider the whole family to address all of the issues. The long-term objective of this network is to strengthen policy and practice related to child trafficking prevention, treatment, and rehabilitation. In order to do this, we want to learn from others. We don't want to just start all over and reinvent the wheel. We want to know what other organizations, other initiatives have learned before us, and they can save a lot of time by sharing what they know, the mistakes they've made, the things they've learned. So we look at partners with expertise in violence, with expertise in poverty, with expertise in social isolation, some of these things that are major factors that lead to trafficking and have a lot of overlapping issues. If you think about it, think about all the things that we've learned about intimate partner violence over the last 25 years. I like to think that where human trafficking is now is where we were with intimate partner violence 25 years ago. It's sort of in its really infant stages of research and learning about what works and what doesn't work and what is needed. And we can learn a lot from the people who have spent all their time with intimate partner violence issues. They have really made a lot of progress, and so we can save time by saying, what are the commonalities here? What are the differences? What can we learn from them? What are some of the prevention techniques that work in those areas? Because there is so much overlap between intimate partner violence and the violence and trauma bonds that are often seen among human trafficking victims and traffickers. We can also learn from people who work with gang violence, for example, or child maltreatment. Boy, there's a lot of overlap with child maltreatment professionals. So that's another reason why ISPCAN is in a good position, because the members of ISPCAN are very familiar with child maltreatment, have a lot of background knowledge. So we're going to form work groups. This is, as I mentioned, this is an early phase. This network is just beginning to take shape. And the idea is to form work groups to understand the conditions leading to child exploitation. The more we understand about the factors that lead to the bad result, the more we can identify ways to prevent this outcome. We want to assess the evidence base that's informing our views. We really need to know, what is it that we really have evidence to show is the truth, and what is it that we just think we know? How much is really based on data, and how much is just our intuition? And there's nothing wrong with intuition, there's nothing wrong with anecdotal data, but we need to sort of sort out what we really know and how well we really know it. And I think that that's something that's extremely important, yet very hard to do, partly because it's hard to find all this information, and nobody has really sat down to say, okay, what is, how good is this program? How good is this report? Is it really based on good data? We want to stimulate ideas and make recommendations for prevention strategies. If we can find out the information, what is known, analyze the background, basic information that's leading our efforts, we can figure out better what types of prevention strategies might work. And then we want to take all this information to develop tools to assist local providers in prevention efforts. So all of this network efforts is really focusing on how we can help people in the trenches, people working directly with victims and survivors, take it to the local level. One of the main things that we want to start out doing, and we're already starting to gather resources, is to come up with a clearinghouse of resources. And imagine this. Imagine if you had one place to go. You go to this network website and you say, I want to know something about child trafficking in India. I'm a social worker in India. I want to know what's available out there for training other social workers on child trafficking. You go to this website and you can find out what are the local resources, national resources in India. What are some of the national laws? What are some of the reports that come out of India? What are some of the issues that are particularly relevant in that area? You can look at research that may be relevant in that area. So you can get information for professionals on a wide variety of issues. And some of these issues we're thinking are the global or the national reports. People like to read, or at least, well, I like to read these global reports from the UN, for example, looking at pictures of what human trafficking is right now in the last few years. What do we know about it? Training curricula. I want to know what's out there to teach medical providers. I'm a medical person myself. I want to know what kind of medical curricula are there for healthcare professionals and how good is it? We want to know about existing prevention programs. People are always asking me, yeah, okay, we can recognize, you're telling us how to recognize victims and how to intervene, but how do we prevent? What's been developed for prevention? And so we need to gather those resources and say, well, here are some resources that may or may not work, but they're directed at kids, or they're directed at adults, or they're directed at buyers. We want to be able to compile relevant research and make it available to people who are interested in learning, sort of getting back to the very basics. Where does this data come from? Where are all these statistics coming from, and what are they based on? Legislation and policies, these will be global, national, local. Find out what's happening in the European Union, for example, or in various countries in Africa. What are the legislation and policies going on there? Protocols and guidelines may be very useful. I get a lot of requests. People say, okay, if I want to talk to my hospital about teaching professionals on how to recognize abuse in the healthcare setting, what kind of protocols do you have? And I'm sure that there are a lot of other professions where protocols are actively being sought, and it's hard to find them. We want to know and compile all the information we can about intervention treatment strategies. What is there that we can look to help treat the post-traumatic stress disorder and the major depression from that survivors so commonly experience? And what about assessment tools? Are there screening tools out there? Are there tools that we can use that may or may not help us identify child victims? If so, we want to know about them, and we want to know whether they're truly proven to be effective or just sort of hypothetical. So when you get your evaluation after this webinar, one of the questions is going to be asking you for your opinion. What do you think we should include in this clearinghouse of resources? We're on the ground level of this clearinghouse, just beginning to pull in as many resources as we can. We want to hear from you what types of things you would use this clearinghouse for. What would be most helpful to you? And we're going to give you this list of options and then have a final option for other, because we may have left out something, and we'd certainly like to hear from you if you think there are other things that should be included in this clearinghouse. But keep in mind, they do not need to be in English. They do not need to be relevant only for the United States or only for the UK, only for the EU. We really want global resources. I also want to talk about an upcoming event. Some of you may be familiar with the San Diego International Conference on Child Maltreatment. Well, ISPCAN does a pre-conference institute every year, and this year the whole day-long institute on January 24th is dedicated to human trafficking. And I am really excited about this because we're going to have a panel of international speakers who are going to be talking about different aspects of human trafficking, labor and sex trafficking, etc. And I think that whether you know a lot about human trafficking now or you only know a little, that it'll be a very profitable, well-spent day. You'll get a lot of new information and make connections with a lot of interesting people. I hope you will consider going. You can get more information by contacting Angela at this website, but we would certainly love to see you there. And that, again, is the day before the San Diego Conference on Child Maltreatment begins. These are the network committee members that are hoping to, that are putting together this network. And as I said, we've been working on this for the last year or so, and I wanted to give a shout out to all of them because it certainly is a major effort on our part. And finally, just to end, if I can make that last slide, whoops, hold on. If you are interested in joining the International Society for the Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect, please consider joining us. This is a great organization, I think. I've been a member for a million years. It's a great organization to make connections with people from all around the world and get great perspectives on child abuse and neglect and child trafficking. People have all sorts of areas of expertise, and we have congresses in various regions of the world and annual conference for everybody in ISPCAN, and it's in different locations every year. And I just learned a tremendous amount, finding out what other people are doing, what the issues are in halfway around the world, the common problems that I'm experiencing, that they are also experiencing, and learning new solutions, new possibilities. It's a great experience. So I encourage you to consider joining that organization as well. That's the end of my presentation, and as I said, it's just a quickie, but I'd be glad to take any questions that people have or any comments. Comment, please also link with Free the Slaves. Good point. Thank you for bringing that out. It's a very, very good point. Good organization. We're also hoping, by the way, that if you are interested in this clearinghouse and interested in using it, that you would feel free to mail us your contact information and resources from your neck of the woods. If you know of a prevention program in your country or region or community, or you know of a research that's been done locally have any information on child sex trafficking or labor trafficking, please let us know, because we'll include it in the clearinghouse, because if it's important to you, it's probably important to a whole lot of other people as well, and we need to get as much input as we can. So we're looking for people to provide input for the clearinghouse. Well, I don't see any questions, but if you come up with questions, please also mention Walk Free Global Slavery Index and Bullying Prevention Program. Yay, you guys are awesome. Thank you very much. Very, very, very much. This is exactly what we need. It's exactly what we need. Looking for other comments. I guess that's probably it. But thank you very much for listening and for tuning in. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks so much for that, Jordan. That was great, and we're really looking forward to seeing your presentation at the Global Institute in January. With that, thanks, Jordan. So with that, we want to thank you all again for joining today's webinar. A recording of this webinar will be available within 48 hours on our website. Please visit us there for more information and consider becoming a member of ISPCAN to have more advanced and exclusive access to webinars like these in the future. Thank you all again for your time and patience, and we hope that you have a great day or night depending on your location. Thanks, everyone.